Welcome to CNS and presentation of our new occasional paper, Options for a Verifiable Freeze on North Korea's Missile Program, with our lovely graphic design there. Excellent staff. Before we get into the substance of the paper itself, I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of the Center about the passing of Senator Lugar, who is a member of our advisory board and a longtime friend and associate and hero, as my boss Phil Potter said of many of us. And I happen to know Senator Lugar for more than 2 decades, first as a congressional reporter, and then through time in the arms control community, including here. And I think Bill, summarized it well when he said he was a visionary legislator and perhaps the last of his kind, a senator who put his country ahead of politics and principle above partisanship. He was a paragon of integrity and was always as attentive and kind to young students as to the most senior officials. And in terms of, he's a very unusual politician in his sort of level of detail and knowledge and mastery of the issues. Sometimes this hurt him. I happen to be one of the few people who was there when he launched his presidential campaign in New Hampshire in 1996. And the most exciting part of that press conference was about Canadian agriculture subsidies. So he was probably too smart to be president. But he was a great man and will be dearly missed. And I think it's kind of appropriate that we're having this event today, because actually one of the last things that he wrote was on North Korea with Senator Nunn. And he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post last year, in which he said, eliminating the nuclear threat and achieving stability and security on the Korean Peninsula will require unconventional thinking and steps that are much broader than denuclearization. Just as we should prepare for the summit, this is before the Singapore summit, to go wrong, we should also prepare for it to go right. And I think this paper actually fits that bill. It's broader than sort of the simple nuclear part of denuclearization, and I hope there's some unconventional thinking in there, at least I think there is. So getting back to the substance of the paper itself, the paper was drafted by the folks up here, except for Mary Beth, who's going to be one of our commentators, and Ferenc Dalnoki-Veress, a colleague in our Monterey office. And I'll introduce the panel in a little bit. It's clear from the Singapore and Hanoi summits that there's a deep gap between what North Korea is advocating, which is a gradual, step-by-step, measure-for-measure approach, and the Trump administration's sweeping call for North Korea to fully denuclearize before sanctions can be lifted. Indeed, recent developments in U.S.-North Korean diplomacy underscore the difficulty of achieving far-reaching disarmament objectives at a stroke. A missile freeze may provide a path around the present impasse in talks. To promote trust and create space for further negotiations, North Korea and its negotiating partners could exchange one or more packages of verifiable, reversible concessions, in addition to the steps already taken along these lines. This could come as one stage in a comprehensive overall agreement, or as part of smaller bite-sized packs. This would not be without precedent. Indeed, a September 1999 agreement not to test long-range ballistic missiles or conduct space launches lasted until July 2006. However, the troubled history of past efforts makes clear that establishing a truly sustainable freeze will be no easy matter. The parties must reach specific and verifiable agreements. Unfortunately, and so far, options for missile freezes and associated verification requirements have not received nearly as much attention as similar measures related to fissile materials and nuclear warheads. This is so even though the freeze approach has already been applied to some extent during the current round of diplomacy. First, around the end of 2017, North Korea informally adopted a freeze on missile flight tests. In April 2018, it declared a suspension of nuclear tests and long-range missile flights. And after the Singapore summit, it dismantled some missile and space-related structures at one facility, notably including a large vertical test stand used for developing powerful liquid propellant engines, although North Korea has recently reversed this last step. Our paper identifies and evaluates options for freezing the testing, production, and deployment of North Korean missiles associated launchers and platforms, among other potential steps. These options might be pursued singly, in combination, or sequentially. The paper identifies some of the global precedents for these activities and describes both the verification requirements and the security benefits associated with each option. While it describes these trade-offs, the paper does not offer any single specific recommendation. Policymakers must supply crucial value judgments, and any freeze agreement must be negotiated, including measures to be extended to the North Koreans. Moreover, any agreement on a missile freeze is likely to come as part of a broader package. Almost certainly, we coupled with measures related to Pyongyang's nuclear arsenal and fissile material stockpile. It may also be linked to agreements related to North Korea's chemical, biological, and conventional weapons. Weighing all of these trade-offs is beyond the scope of the present analysis. But we hope that a better understanding of the options for a verifiable freeze of North Korea's missile programs can provide some of the raw material for creative policy. So in the panel today, we'll begin with Josh Pollack to my right, who's the editor of the Nonproliferation Review and a senior researcher here at the center. Then Dave Schmerler, who's senior research associate at the center, will talk about the North Korean missile complex. Joy Nasr, immediately to my left, talk about some of the precedents for verification. Josh will then wrap up with looking at some of the security benefits and options of various freeze possibilities. And we have the honor of having a former Ms. Student, Ms. Alum, who's now at the Congressional Research Service, Mary Beth Nikitin, who will provide commentary on our paper. I wanted to also express support or appreciation, I should say, for the support of the Korea Foundation, which sponsored this report. So thank you to them making this possible, and we really appreciate the support. Josh?
Thank you, Mark. First thing I want to say is our report is now online. We don't have the nice glossy copies yet, but if you just type in that shorter URL you see on the screen, it'll come right up. So with that, I'd simply like to hit the high points that will give you a sense of what we're going to show you in the next half an hour, 45 minutes or so. It's very detailed, so please consider these just your signposts. What basic lessons we have taken away from this study and hope to convey to you in this report. First of all, as Dave Schmerler will show us, the missile complex is vast. We don't know where everything is. What we have identified, either firmly or tentatively, covers a great deal of the country. There are some noticeable clusters, but we're really looking at a coast-to-coast program. Second, as Joy Nasr will explain, to understand what's possible, we do not have to invent a great deal. There are precedents for this type of activity. There are models, and if you line them up and look at them, they offer a ready-made toolkit of verification practices and options. That doesn't mean that nothing new would have to be negotiated, nothing novel, but there's a lot out there, and it's an excellent starting point. Third, as I will discuss, freeze is not necessarily just about building some confidence and creating space for in-depth negotiations. It also provides security benefits because it curtails arms tracing. It prevents the North Koreans from further advancing their programs, depending on how it's designed. But the sooner you put it in place, the better. I would point to the failure of the Leap Day deal in 2012, which involved a freeze on missile testing. Since that fell apart, the North Koreans have conducted about Shay, what would you say, about 3/4 of their missile flight tests in their history? So that's just in the past half decade, really. And if we had had the benefit of the freeze earlier, a lot of the gains and the maturation of their program would not be locked in. But it's not too late to derive other benefits. Finally, as I will discuss before I hand off to Mary Beth, there are a lot of moving parts here. There are trade-offs. The more aggressive the freeze approach, the more intrusive it will be and probably the less acceptable to the North Koreans. However, it's not a straight line relationship. More intrusive does not mean more beneficial. And what we aim to do is to draw out where some of the opportunities are for a more beneficial, less intrusive approach. Once again, we don't point to an ideal answer and say that's the answer. There are simply too many other considerations we can't anticipate. What we aim to do is, as Miles said, is to portray the landscape for decision makers so they can make informed choices. And with that, I'd like to hand off to Dave. I can run the slides, or Miles, so would you like to?
Sure. Interesting. Tell me when you, I'm going to switch to.
Sure, I thought starting on the image section, we go forward to the, yeah, there we go.
The first one? One.
There.
Just, here, we can start with this.
There we go.
All right, so I don't know if you can probably see, yeah, that's Jamie. This is a crude kind of outline of some of the sites that we know about related to North Korea's missile production, testing, and manufacturing program. We can see that it's spread all across the entire country. It started small and modest under Kim Il-sung during Kim Jong-il expanded, and the current program we have goes all the way from the west coast to the east coast, from the south to the north, maybe excluding the northeastern area right there. There are some clusters that Josh is talking about. We have clusters around Pyongyang. Pyongyang is where we've seen a lot of manufacturing and R&D activity. We see a cluster around Busan, which is where we saw a lot of manufacturing and testing activity. There is an interesting trend happening near Hamhung and Hungnam, which is where the majority of our solid fuel program is located, and then we have some outliers on the coast as well.
Let me give you kind of people's way. I think.
I got it. So one of the interesting clusters that Josh mentioned earlier was their solid fuel program. So North Korea's had a liquid fuels program for quite some time. It's a couple of decades now. The solid fuel program, while it existed, has expanded significantly within the past 5 to 6 years, and a lot of that expansion is happening around Hamhung. Hamhung is where North Korea produces the solid propellant for their solid fuel program. So it seems like a lot of the expansion activity towards the Puguksan 1 and Puguksan 2 program have been expanding in the Hamhung, Hungnam, and Chimpo area as well. So Chimpo would be the solid fuel SLBM, which is where that testing activity happens, especially land-based and underwater SLBM injection testing. We have the, that's right there. We have the number 17 explosives factory in the Hamhung fertilizer complex, which is an area that was known for producing and casting solid propellant material. We had the Magumpo solid fuel motor testing, which is relatively recent, sometime around 2015, 2016. And then as recent as last year, we saw the rapid expansion of their complex carbon material production capability at the Chemical Material Institute, which is in Hamhung proper. So this seems to be the central area for their solid fuel program. However, if we're talking about their liquid fuel rocket program, this clustering pattern goes out the window because it's spread across the entire country. If we were to go back to the previous slide here, everything else is pretty much related to liquid fuel testing and development or for vehicle manufacturing. So outside of Hamhung, if you're going to try to create some type of way to verify or monitor all the sites related to liquid fuel production or propellant production and testing, it would be very expensive across the entire country. Another interesting thing that we have is that North Korea has a fairly diverse spread of testing infrastructure. So one of the first test stands that we had, I believe, was either Changchun or the one at Tonghae. We haven't seen any activity at Tonghae, but Changchun has been active, or at least within the past 5 years. That's what it did. The reentry vehicle engine testing, and the site still seems to be in working function. In fact, in the last 2 years, we've seen some modest adjustments to that site. So the site's not just in a state of being maintained, but it's something that's slowly being expanded on. The liquid fuel engine test stand at Sohae, the top left, is where we've seen the majority of the activity. That's where North Korea's conducted their largest, most recent engine tests. That's also where they have conducted some engine tests that they haven't shown us pictures of, or they didn't show us pictures until the July 4th ICBM test, which was really interesting as well. We have a solid fuel motor test stand at Magunpo. North Korea has been producing smaller solid fuel rockets for quite some time before they started developing the Pukguksong 1 and 2. So I have a feeling there's another couple solid fuel engine test stands somewhere across the country that existed before Magunpo, because they're producing solid fuel field rockets and whatnot. It's just figuring out where those are is kind of a complicated question, because smaller test stands can be a bit harder to find. So these are just the 4 that we know of, but there could certainly be more. So one of the interesting things that happened recently with Kim Jong-un is that the testing locations have exponentially expanded. So during Kim Il-sung and then Kim Jong-il, we had testing that primarily happened near Tonghae on the top red square right there. The red dot represents the number of tests at a certain location. And Wonsan, which is right there near that cluster of 3. So that's where traditionally almost all of North Korea's missile testing happened. Then when Kim Jong-un came into power, that spread just blew up. Now North Korea can test a missile and do test missiles up until recently wherever they want to. It is actually kind of absurd to look at it from a non-North Korean perspective. The North Koreans can test at airports. They can test on the highway. They've tested in fields during the off season outside of their space launch center, so they could test it in, but they test it out. They can also construct a pad in under 3 days and test anywhere they want to. So that's something that we noticed with the Boston 14 tests, and that's something that we also noticed with the Boston 15 tests, is that we've got somewhere between 2 to 3 days where at nighttime they'll roll in, construct a pad. You won't notice it or know what it is because there's a lot of construction happening in North Korea around the year, and then next thing you know, you get an alert on your phone from Twitter saying North Korea tested a missile. You get a picture and you're like, oh, that's what that pad was. Could have been a foundation for a greenhouse, or is it going to be a launch pad for a missile? I don't know, and we won't know until they use that launch site. So this is something that's really interesting. That's kind of evolved under Kim Jong-un. On occasion, they'll just drive up to where he is and launch a missile. So this is at I believe, an Air Force retreat at the end of the Kalma Airport. And there was a new Scud test off the track with the maneuvering fins for the reentry vehicle for the warhead. And it just rolled up on the road. There was nothing special about the road. It erected, it launched, and Kim Jong-un just walked out a window and saw the thing go up. So if you want to talk about trying to constrain or monitor test locations for the missiles, that's going to be a big problem, because the span of Kim Jong-un's kind of career, he's kind of started this trend where the North Koreans can just test and will test wherever the hell they want to. So this is going to be one of the interesting constraints, is that there really isn't necessarily anything restraining them, unlike other countries where the Americans, we won't, or the Russians won't test in a large metropolitan area. The North Koreans could get away with it because they just do whatever they want to do on the testing front. And then another issue that we're running into, or that we've noticed during Kim Jong-un's period here, is that they're using temporary structures. So in the past, there was a famous vehicle assembly site, or a structure, where there was a arced, section on the roof where they would practice the erecting and then lowering of the missile tomahawk to make sure that everything functioned well, right? To make sure that the truck would do what it needs to do. That building was very unique. If I were to see that building elsewhere in North Korea, I would know automatically what that building's purpose is, what its function is, right? During the kind of explosion into their Boston 14 and Boston 15 ICBM development, that changed, because now they're no longer modifying buildings to leave a permanent signature, but they're constructing temporary structures. So this is the March 16 vehicle factory. This is where they produce trucks and vehicles for both civilian and military uses. And when the North Koreans needed to test the arm-raising mechanism of the Blossom 15 cell, which is a modified version of what they use for 14. They just built a tower, a scaffolding tower outside of the assembly hall. They practiced the erecting motion of the missile tail arm, and then they took it down. And when they wanted to use it again, they would just build it again. So they've done this like 3 or 4 times. So they don't leave it up. They'll just build it overnight. They'll use it, and then they'll take it back down again, which is something that's really interesting too, because the speed in which they can deploy the reconstruction or deconstruction of the sites is seen at Sohae, where they took down the site, partially dismantled the site fairly quickly, and the minute things started to go south for the North Koreans was they didn't permanently dismantle anything. They put most of the site back together again in a very short period of time. So now we're seeing this kind of shift to lighter, mobile, temporary testing structures where it's going to be harder to pin down exactly where these activities are. Thanks, guys.
Thanks. So in our report, we looked at 4 major precedents for verification for these models that could either develop some kind of menu for future negotiators, as Josh mentioned, or that could guide the negotiations due to the precedents. Now, it is fair to say that there are definitely a lot more than these 4. But for example, the CTR programs that demilitarize some of the post-Soviet states, or the retrieval of missiles from Libya, were not taken into consideration here because they were more focused on WMD elimination and disarmament rather than missile freezes per se. So we focused on the monitoring and verification of Iraq's missile program through the UN Special Commission, and then following the UN Monitoring and Verification Inspection Commission. We are looking at the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty gives us an example of a selective disarmament where some missiles can be taken into consideration and others not, whereas the Iraq case gives us an example of forced disarmament. And the last 2 will be the US South Korean missile guidelines and the MTCR. So the UNESCOM was formed in 1991 after the first Iraq war under Security Council Resolution 687, and essentially with the mandate to remove and destroy all of Iraq's WMDs and their means of delivery, including any missiles over 150 kilometers. The Commission took a very comprehensive approach to verification and used some advanced remote sensing technologies and aerial vehicles, and also depended quite heavily on foreign intelligence to fulfill its mandate because Iraq was non-compliant and not very cooperative with the declarations and with the mandate. Naturally, this created a lot of distrust between Iraq and UNESCOM, and UNESCOM was accused of being a tool of foreign intelligence, and shortly before the 98 December strikes on Iraq by the US, UNESCOM withdrew and later disbanded in December 99. This was taken over immediately by UN MOVIC, the Monitoring and Verification Inspection Commission, under the direction of Hans Blix, the former Director General of the IAEA. And now, though UN MOVIC was not allowed to enter Iraq for 3 years, starting in 1999, but it did use this time very wisely. It studied which sites in Iraq to visit. It studied the shortfalls and the problems that UNESCOM faced with the Iraqis, even the political issues there. And also, these 3 years worked in its favor because it allowed some technological developments into other technologies that allowed UN MOVIC to study the Iraqi missile program and prepare for it in a far less intrusive and a more efficient manner than UNESCOM was considered to do. Now, even though Iraq was not very compliant and not cooperative with either of those missions, they were still considered quite successful, actually. In total, there were 731 inspections at 411 sites, covering the technologies behind me, from fuel oxidizers and launch sites and launchers, and even propellant engines. Now, if we are to look at the UNESCOM and UN MOVIC situation and see what we can take from it for North Korea, some similarities first come to mind. The fact is that both had their origins in Soviet Scud short-range ballistic missiles. and both extensively used foreign cooperation and export and import of missile technology and expertise to basically develop their missiles into more sophisticated systems. And of course, both pursued longer range solid propellant systems, though to very different varying degrees of success. But this does not mean that anything that happened in the case of UNESCOM and UNMOVIC can be directly transferred to the North Korea case. In fact, North Korea's program is far more extensive and diverse than Iraq's. In fact, Dave's presentation showed us the breadth of that program and some of the issues that would provide problems, not only in verification, but even at the declaration stage at the beginning. North Korea is also unlikely to accept a very short limit on its range like Iraq at 150 kilometers. It's probably going to be difficult to get North Korea to agree to give up its short and medium range ballistic systems. And the idea that the UN or another verification system will be able to have unfettered access to North Korea, as UNMOVIC later had with Iraq, not at the beginning, but later did, is highly unlikely. North Korea only chooses to open up particular sites under very certain conditions. And though they have in the past, in the early 2000s, accepted or offered to open up certain verification measures or set up permanent static ground presence, that it doesn't seem that that'll be as easy again, especially given the way things have been going. So, but UNMOVIC actually did, in its 2007 report when it disbanded because there was finally a democratically and constitutionally elected government in Iraq. And in its final report, the Commission gave several lessons on what a missile verification system can look like in the future. Two very important lessons are that, one, a complete knowledge and understanding of the missile program is required for its success. That means some form of initial declarations will always be required. It also would have to be project-based and site-based, based on all of those different, based on the breadth of the program, as seen in Dave's part of this presentation. But most importantly, it also identified or introduced the idea of critical points into the verification system. And this works a lot like the material balance safeguards in nuclear safeguards. And the idea is that where different parts of the program could finally converge, or at a certain point where very important equipment is used, that is where verification should be focused. And the idea is that those points of a certain project or program cannot be bypassed and cannot be avoided if the missile program is to be successful. In fact, the UNMOVIC provided this diagram in its report on liquid propellant engines. And for LPEs, you can see that there are four critical points, including static and dynamic testing and the balancing of the rotor assembly. According to UNMOVIC, now verifying these points would be as useful as a comprehensive verification approach, but would be, again, far less intrusive and a lot more efficient in its mandate. Now, the INF Treaty is a perfect example of selective disarmament. We all know that INF Treaty is probably counting down its days now, but still, it is very useful to take into account the unprecedented verification measures that this treaty put forward. I want to focus far less on the scope of the INF and a lot more on those verification precedents that could guide any future arrangement with North Korea. So the treaty banned all missiles between 500 and all ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles between 500 and 5,500 kilometers, but most importantly, put forward several prongs. It was a multi-pronged approach to verification. One was an unprecedented use of national technical means and particularly satellite imagery. The idea of missile parades or exhibits was a bit novel at this point, and those functioned. Basically, every party of the treaty had a certain number of missile parades or exhibits a year, where they would be required to remove the roof of any fixed structures on their missile bases or facilities, take the missiles and their launchers out into the open for a certain number of hours agreed upon to allow the other party to take satellite imagery of the missiles. Doing so would allow them to count the number of missiles and to some extent the type of the missile as well. And that was coupled with, at the time, an also unprecedented level of OSIs, on-site inspections. At the beginning, there was an initial declaration, a live exchange of information, and on the transfer of these systems was set up. And baseline inspections were initiated to ascertain that the declarations were accurate. Elimination inspections made sure that INF's missile systems have been dismantled. Closeout inspections essentially ensured that a facility was free of all INF systems, and short notice inspections decreased in a number per year as the years went on. But one important point there is that those on-site inspections, meant to obviously deter non-compliance, went on for 10 years after the treaty was signed. Now, almost every arms control treaty after the INF had 5 years of OSIs, became the norm, but this reflects the immense level of mistrust at the time of signature of the treaty, that they believed there was 10 years that would be preferably required. And also, since this was a permanent ban on all ground-launched ballistic missile systems within that range, a permanent portal production monitoring was set up at the Vokinsk facility in the Ural Mountains. It's a solid rocket motor production facility. And the way that this facility would work, essentially, so that's all the production. Now, US inspectors, for example, they placed around 30 near it at the US monitoring complex. They were not allowed to go in. However, once a missile or missile system or its parts was exiting the facility at the portal over there, the experts over there would basically take a cargo scan X-ray, a horizontal slice, not vertical, a horizontal slice of the missile, or of the container rather. And they made it practice to take the part of the missile that begins to curve down or where it begins to end, so that they could more easily measure the diameter of the missile to determine whether it is an INF type or not. And the Russians, for their part, put a lot of did different things to try to cover sensitive design information inside that cargo container. This is actually Martin Pfeiffer. This is the train that would usually be carrying the missile coming in before the cargo scan X-ray would take a slice of it. The Russians also, or the Soviets at that time, placed also some scientists at Magna, Utah. But I believe they discontinued that in 2001 due to some financial reasons. Now, before I actually move forward, I want to bring up the immense air of mistrust that was present at the signing of the INF Treaty actually is very similar to the way progress has been stalled on some of the North Korea talks. However, verification should always take into consideration realistic capabilities and not intentions. That's what I believe. So there will always be mistrust with North Korea in the foreseeable future, as there has always been mistrust between Russia and the US. But if we are to focus on realistic capabilities and take the correct mix of verification measures to ensure that at the end of the day, North Korea will not be able to produce a certain class of missiles, then that should be enough. And the INF does provide a set between its on-site inspections, national technical means, its declaration and live exchange system, as well as the portal production monitoring. Even this, by the way, was brought up in the early 2000s by North Korea. It was offered. So it is not something completely novel. Maybe more relevant to this case would be the US and South Korea missile guidelines. They go back to the 1970s. At the beginning, they were set up at 180 kilometer, maximum range 180 kilometers for a payload of 500 kilograms. They were later expanded in 95 to 300 kilometers, but then included the add-on of some extensive verification measures because even South Korea was found in non-compliance of the earlier limitations with the United States. So the United States decided to put inspections of its missile production facilities, at that time over 300 kilometers. And it required full disclosure on all R&D on civilian rocket research and the space program, as well as various other things. In exchange, South Korea got defense technology cooperation. Now, more recently, in 2012, that range limit was increased to 800 kilometers, and the Trump administration in November 2017 dropped the payload limits entirely. Now, how is that going to be relevant here? Well, first of all, North Korea is very unlikely to accept any more restrictive guidelines than the Republic of Korea. And in fact, if they are going to accept things like that, they are likely not to accept the intrusive verification. But there are alternatives, and there are ways, there are various degrees of these measures that can be implemented. For example, instead of putting in intrusive verification and giving North Korea the same limits as South Korea, 800, 300 kilometers at 500 kilograms, they can accept stricter limits on payload and range. As for the space program, now that's where it can get interesting, I believe, and that's where really there is a lot of room for creative thought there. Because, for example, there could be launch services from Russia or China. China has a spot in Hainan it could launch from and not jeopardize Japan, technically. There could be, as previously suggested, some kind of regional or inter-Korean R&D on space. And North Korea already has Landsat satellite imagery. It could be further provided some access to other satellite constellations that could be very helpful to it in its agriculture and disaster management. Those are very important points for it. So there's a lot of room for creativity. Even if, for example, Lockheed Martin, I remember, actually developed a satellite, a highly subsidized satellite commissioned by the US for Vietnam and for a few other countries as well. So there is room. Things like that can still exist. And that's how we've approached these precedents. We've taken everything into consideration, the negatives, but also we recognize that everything can be adaptable to be amenable to both parties. The MTCR, of course, is always floated around. We like to put it up there because it's always going to come up, though it is a voluntary mechanism without the capability to ascertain compliance. It places limitations up to on missiles over 300 kilometers and up to 500 kilograms. But what's interesting and what we think could be useful for the North Korean case from the MTCR is its annex. It is its two lists of controlled items. Cat 1 items are full rocket systems and their subsystems, including rocket engines, the missile parts, SLVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. Sorry, SLV is a space launch vehicle. And a Cat 2 is basically any dual-use item that could create a Cat 1 item. These are in the annex of the MTCR guidelines, all of them found online. And though this system is voluntary, if you can look at this list, Cat 1 and Cat 2, as a menu that future negotiators can work with North Korea. And it also provides this, as well as the UNESCOM and UN MOVIC reports, they also provide comprehensive indicators of non-compliance to be able to monitor exports and imports of various technologies into North Korea to ensure that that they are fully compliant with the agreements. I believe that is it for me before handing it to Josh.
Yes. Sure. Okay, so we've now seen the extent of the problem physically, some of its characteristics. We've seen what some of the tools are, but how do these pieces fit together? It's not obvious if you just look at these two presentations in isolation. So what we've done is we've tried to identify specific gains that could be achieved through this. The most obvious thing, of course, is just to reduce tensions and create space for in-depth negotiations. It's similar to what the United States and North Korea did in '93, the framework in 1994. It's somewhat similar to the approach that the P5+1 took with Iran in 2003, leading to the agreement in 2013, leading to the agreement in 2015. And that is probably the most elementary piece. But the details do matter. And we've identified 4 points where prospective advances in North Korea's missile program can be held in check by a verifiable piece. And you see them here. So let's walk through them one by one. Next slide, please. The first is simply carrying larger payloads to longer distances. Now, I won't read the slide. I will just point out that this is a trick. There's nothing we can do here. The capability is cheap. And I put this up here merely to make the point that sooner is better. You want to get ahead of these problems. There is an asterisk on the capabilities, which is that some of these systems do not have well-demonstrated reliability. As our colleague Element has argued quite forcefully. The flight testing has been limited, especially for intermediate range and ICBMs. But we'll deal with that separately. The main point here is, again, this is a lesson. The sooner we can get something into place, the more it will matter for us in a very practical sense. Next slide. 2, achieving greater survivability. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, North Korea has a real problem from a military standpoint, which is that it faces enemies that are technologically superior. And while North Korea has a very dense air defense system, that doesn't mean that its opponents, notably South Korea and the United States, cannot break through using a variety of approaches, stealth technology, standoff weapons, etc. And so this means that anything on the ground in North Korea is potentially exposed to attack. And that sets up a kind of arms racing dynamic where the North Koreans try to achieve greater stealth or survivability of their systems and their missile systems, and the United States and South Korea take more and more aggressive steps to counteract that. So to try to put a stop to this dynamic, a freeze could do a couple of things. One is it could hold in check North Korea's development of solid propellant missiles. These are more survivable by nature. They involve, when you're talking about mobile missiles, ground mobile missiles, the caravan of support vehicles for solid propellant missiles is smaller than for liquid propellant missiles, so it's less intrusive. Move it around, and there will be fewer opportunities to spot it. Furthermore, the missile can get off the ground more quickly because the fuel is actually built into the missile. There's relatively less preparation. Now, these differences are perhaps marginal differences, but these differences also do add up. The second thing is North Korea has a missile submarine program that would, if it continues to progress, it will diversify where they can launch from. Even if it might be easy to track their submarines, I suppose. I don't know if it's true, but let's assume that. It just adds to the tasks that their opponents will have to carry out. They'll have to trail that sub, they'll have to make determinations about what to do with it. One sub, it just makes the problem more complex. So freezing those 2 points can help put a stop to the progress of the upgrades. Next slide, Now, the other way that we try to counteract missile arsenal is ballistic missile defense. And of course, that also leads to an arms race dynamic. There essentially are two ways for the North Koreans or anyone else to try to counteract ballistic missile defense. So there's a quantitative approach and a qualitative. The quantitative approach is you just roll out more launchers and you shoot more at once. And that can do a couple things. One is eventually it makes the defender run out of shots. But even before then, it can saturate the defense, meaning just put too many incoming objects into the sky for the system to handle it, and just overwhelm the sensors, overwhelm the processing capability, overwhelm just the battle management, the ability to send the interceptor missiles where they have to go. And we saw that in some of the testing pictures that Dave showed us earlier. The North Koreans have been rehearsing it. So if they are able to produce and deploy more launch vehicles and more missiles, of course, that will enhance their ability to undertake the saturation strategy. The second thing, and Dave also showed that test launch, was a Scud with a maneuvering warhead. This is the qualitative approach where you simply have missiles that are better equipped to overcome EMT singly or in use. And a maneuvering warhead is the only way to do this. If you could try to juke the interceptors in the skies or dance around them and move around unpredictably before it arrives at its target. But they've only flight tested that successfully once, as far as we know. We don't know exactly how well it performed. So I think it's fair to say that it's not necessarily let's say it's not mature. So there are ways to put a stop to advances there. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then this is the what I promised to discuss. Start, which is more reliable. Essentially, if we assume that the missile force as a whole will work successfully 75% of the time, that's very different from both the preemption and the defense side of things than if it works 95%. So, just common sense, I would think. So, the engine testing on the ground at the 4 or perhaps more sites that Dave pointed out, but also the flight testing takes place in many different sites. Freezing those are the best available ways to prevent advances. So now the question is, now that we sort of understand what we would want to freeze to achieve, ideally, how do we make the tools do these things? What kinds of agreements are available? How do we use those verification methods to achieve some or all of those gains? We've identified 6 options. I'm not going to get into the last 3, although Joy did touch on some of them. But you can read the report if you want to learn more about those last 3. For now, because our time is limited, we just focus on the main options, which I think fit more neatly into the framework I just showed. It doesn't mean that the other 3 are bereft of value, and we'll get to how these things could build on each other. So basically, you see 3 main options. Freeze on missile testing. That could mean flight testing, or it could mean flight and ground testing of engines. Freeze on new missile deployments, which means pushing new missiles and perhaps launchers out to the operating base. And there are an unknown number of operating bases, but probably like a couple dozen, with different types of missiles based in different locations, and then in a crisis or in wartime, they would flush out from their bases. They would go on the move to other sites. Or perhaps they just sit behind the tunnels, you don't know. But some of the measures that Joy discussed could get at that, and not adding more to these bases. The final option is to freeze on production. That could be production of missiles themselves, launchers, and platforms. Platform, in this instance, what we mean by that is submarines. So, next slide, please. So, if we were to seek a freeze on missile business, which to some extent already exists, it would hit 3 of those security benefits, because it would prevent North Korea from taking key steps in developing solid propellant missiles that get off the ground. Right now, they have what we call close-range missiles, which are tactical in nature and probably are too small in diameter to carry nuclear weapons. They also have medium-range solid propellant missils that are fairly new, and submarine-launched ones that are based on medium-range ones. So there are a lot of gaps. There's no short range. There's no equivalent to Scuds. There's no IRBMs, no ICBMs in this category. So as long as there's a freeze on missile testing in place, that program, while it can advance in R&D, it cannot really come to fruition. Second is less improvement of EMD penetration. I already mentioned the maneuver and warhead on Scud. If they don't get to test that a second, third, fourth, fifth time, they'll be at a disadvantage. But also, it will place less stress on the alliance with THAAD deployment, for example. It's a very stressful event for everyone. Do we really want to have to do that again? To add more? And then finally, less improvement of the reliability, especially with relatively novel IRBMs and ICBMs. So this actually covers a lot of ground by itself. And in a sense, I'd say it's a no-brainer. Because how do you verify? The really nice thing about verification of flight testing is that the United States has already invested a great deal for purposes of early warning and missile defense. There are satellite constellations in geosynchronous orbit that cover virtually all of the globe with infrared sensors that can see the heat of a boosting engine as soon as it breaks through cloud cover, or if there's no cloud cover, as soon as it ignites. So it is really nothing to it, relatively speaking, to verify a flight test vehicle, despite North Korea's ability to test unpredictably from anywhere. As soon as it happens, the allies will know. Now, ground testing is a little tricky. They can cover that up, cover up the flame. They can make it a little harder to see what's going on. But here, some of the ideas from the INF Treaty, voluntary transparency measures to assist national technical needs could be brought to bear. If the North Koreans pledge not to do that, they can make a good faith gesture that allows us to verify it without getting boots on the ground. This came up in the discussion earlier, so I'd like to explain this a little bit better. This is the large vertical test stand at Sohae. So what you see here is here's a rocket engine being tested. This is from the North Korean. There's the plane. You see this bridge here, and that's a cover that helps them hide activity there so they can move stuff back and forth. This also is a cover, so you can't really see what's going on. The only way that we know if a test took place, as far as I'm aware, is one that you put it in the media like this. But after the fact, you can see that local vegetation and satellite pictures. So if you look at the structure of this thing, you've got the bridge, and you have these heavy concrete piers, this four-legged structure. This is the base. Then on top of it is a steel frame that holds the missile, and holds the engine, sorry, and this cover that hides activity, and I guess keeps the ring too. Next slide. So here's a Planet Labs image of the test stand from 2017. This is viewed from this direction, from the northwest. So you see here is that bridge. Actually, there's an even larger cover on this bridge. This is a concrete pad. Here's the bridge. And here's the tower. See the shadow here? So here's that tower structure on top. And the legs, the concrete legs are here. They're a little hard to see, but they're there, and you can see their shadows. Pretty cool. So that's what it looked like before. Now, after the Singapore summit, next slide. And here you're going to have to adjust your view because the satellite is moving this direction from the southeast. So here are the legs of the concrete base, and there's the top. And there's nothing on top. There's no tower. There's the shadow. It's concrete. And there's the bridge with no cover. So they took the top off in a way that we can clearly see it's not being used. First of all, there's no frame to hold the engine. But second, they don't appear to have moved the frame away. Just piled up the pieces here on the concrete pad. You can see them. So it's not like they were reconstituting it somewhere else. So this was a voluntary measure, very much in that spirit where we can just use national technical means and we can say, yes, this facility is available for use. No, it is not. It's fairly straightforward. Next slide. And unfortunately, now it's back together. But that does illustrate the point. And it goes to what Miles said before, which is some of these measures have actually already come to play in the current applications. So, okay, moving on to freeze on new deployments. This really touches on 2 points. If they don't put a submarine out to sea, or more than one submarine, and right now they only have a test submarine that never leaves the vicinity of its dock. But if they don't make advances here, then they don't get that extra dimension of survivability by going to sea. And also, it blocks the quantitative approach, the swamping BMD saturation, if you don't get to build up the arsenal. Now, this is trickier from a verification standpoint. Now, with the submarine program, you probably could do that with NTM and maybe some voluntary measures. If they agreed not to do it, for example, they could take the loose off the construction halls at the shipyard where they build their missile sites. They built the first one, and we could see nothing going on. But even without that, you can kind of see whether there's activity or not. And certainly if a submarine goes in the water, you can see that. So even without voluntary measures, that's not that hard. If they agree to it, you can verify it reasonably well. But once you get into the ground-based force, it's a different ballgame. First of all, they show little interest in declaring their operating bases. They're spread around the country. They are very well hidden. Dave and our colleague Jeffrey Lewis, I believe it was last year, found a couple of bases where they had dug out an underground facility, dumped a lot of the dirt on top, and then planted trees in the dirt. So within a couple of years, you just had a hillside forest and some roads. It didn't look like much, and it was only in the winter when the trees got clean, you could see it was there. And you had to go back through the historical imagery to see the construction. So they've made real efforts to hide where the bases are. They never show those off to anyone, as far as I know. That's pretty touchy. So doing on-site inspections there, that would be really tough. I think this would be demanding to negotiate, and they probably would be reluctant to do it in the first place. So this is where you get to sort of the steep part of the hill, so it's where you get much more effort, maybe not as much payoff. Next slide. Now, freeze on new production. This essentially gets you one thing, which if we're including the sub in the previous category, and this is just about missiles and launchers. And this is just about the BMD penetration. Now, I put it that way because I'm thinking really about nuclear delivery systems. And I think of it in a kind of all or nothing way. If it gets through BMD, you're having a bad day. If you're thinking about conventionally armed missiles, having more missiles isn't just about the enemy. It's also about blowing up more airfields, striking more enemy formations, etc. Don't really go there, but you know, this problem I think is fairly significant. I would refer you back to the not just the whole THAAD controversy, but the cost of building up missile tests. So what would you have to do to get to a verifiable freeze-on production? First of all, you'd have to declare the production facility. We've already found some of these. And in the spirit of the critical points approach that Unmovic formulated, I think we don't have to find every, although we should understand the entire program, we don't have to monitor every point. If you can point to the specific places where critical components, you know, where engines are assembled or where missiles are assembled, you could focus your efforts. Now, this is where there's a divergence, and the details start to matter, and we cannot fully anticipate how this will go. One is if a particular plant is frozen, period. All activity is frozen. You can see that with national technical needs. You'll see there are no vehicles coming and going. There are no containers coming and going. There are no personnel around in and around the plant. Just there'll be no activity. So in many ways, that is pretty straightforward. And it's all or nothing approach to get the plant. But what if the plant is multi-purpose, or if the terms of the freeze agreement, you know, the exact range of missiles that are permitted and those that are not, what if that sort of cuts down the middle of the plant, the way it did at Botkiss or at Magna under INF? Then you would need a more selective, a more discriminating verification approach. And that's where it wouldn't necessarily look just like the monitoring arrangement of Botkiss, but there could be more automation, and it doesn't have to be that way, but you might have to think in those terms. I will not argue that this is too intrusive for the North Koreans. They would walk with this. They've accepted a standing presence at the Yongbyon nuclear site. The benefit of this is you don't move around. You're fixed in place. You do not have authority to run around the country the way that UNSCOM or UNMOVIC did. So I think this is does not exceed their sensitivities. However, it would take time to negotiate and to identify or develop the right technologies. So this is not an overnight affair, the way something with national technical needs is. Next slide. So if you think about it, one way to do this is pick one. You get one freeze deal before you get the final. And you know, so it could be NTM only, NTM with voluntary measures, like take the roofs off of all of your static engine sites, take the roof off your shipyard construction halls, or you could have this fuller business. I think that declaration and on-site inspection for operating bases of mobile missiles, I'm not optimistic about that. Whereas on-site monitoring, you know, again, it could take a while to put in place, but I think an agreement could be reached. That's not out of the question. Next slide. So, what are we trying to achieve with that? Again, I think the freeze-on missile testing is a no-brainer, and it's already in place informally, although you will be hard-pressed to find any documented agreement where Kim Jong-un said he would not test any missile. Only long-range ones, IRBs, IC. So it has been, clearly, nothing's been happening for a while, but, you know, locking that in might be some value. Whereas the freeze on new deployments, most intrusive, and then the freeze on production, some of the same benefits as this, the devil's in the details. So you can kind of see that you would almost certainly want to have some version of this. You might want to pursue some of this. And I'm skeptical we can achieve that. But again, the details matter, and we don't recommend a very specific approach. Another point, next slide, is instead of viewing it as one and done, when you get your freeze, and then on that basis you negotiate denuclearization. You could think of a cumulative, stepwise approach, and here's where some of those additional options come. You start with the test freeze, then you get the engine ground test freeze, then you get the maybe component productions, and then you can sort of add things, and so you could enhance it piece by piece. This implies a very protracted engagement, and it slices the salami very thin. I don't know how realistic it is as written, but I think it illustrates the concept that when we think about this problem, we should not assume it's a one and done approach. There's maybe more than one way to put these tools to use. Next slide, please. At this point, I would like to hand off to Meredith McKee to discuss what you've just seen. And after Meredith speaks, we'll go to questions again.
Great. Well, thank you for asking me to offer some thoughts. As you can tell, this paper continues the INF educational paper tradition of being extremely useful as well as useful. I think this particular piece really helps us break down what is being thrown out there all the time and it often is an afterthought, and even the phrase ballistic missiles is used in a general way in various commentaries, even official statements and even so I really appreciate this attempt to first start with writing down what they have and what it means when they call it intermediate or long range, but just kind of back to basics. So that's a very useful part of the paper when you get to see the full copy. They show their homework, but they also help us sort through it and are clear and concise. I also appreciated, besides the definitional aspect, the precedents. We've seen that in some of the other cases of Nonproliferation that did on verification in hospitable environments. So we'll say last year, this one adds to that literature. And since we even have unmotivated inspectors in the room, I'm glad to see that we're looking back at that history. Because it's writing on North Korea, as most of you in this room already know, there's not a lot to point to as what we can use as a precedent, other than talks with North Korea that have not come to fruition in the past. So some of these other cases are certainly useful. In particular, I would say I have a lot written down, both in my paper copy and in my notes. So forgive me if it's kind of a potpourri of questions, because I think that's what the book is discussing, not an academic discussion. But in this case, I'm trying to jumpstart our discussion with all of you and the authors. So I wanted to look back at when we first came to the brink of a missile deal in the past. Just briefly, I've kind of been going back to the history. But if you recall, Secretary Albright and President Clinton's administration was very, very close to achieving the exact three items that are outlined here. So in 2000, the draft agreement was to include pledge not to produce, test, or deploy ballistic missiles with a range of 300 kilometers and with 500 kilogram payload, which is the MTCR guideline. Because at that time, they also wanted to match the limits on the South missile program. And they also were going to agree, supposedly, to do no export of missile component technology and training. And there was active discussion of launching satellites by others. So those things were part of it. The deal that was about to conclude. They were not able to resolve the verification specifics, and that's one very helpful part of this paper, including whether a declaration should be done and when. Also, there was, especially within the U.S. government, debate over what to do with the existing. So that was a point of contention that we may have to revisit in the future. And of course, the eternal question of intent. So what is it worth to us? What would the North Koreans accept? So that year, if you go back through all the press clippings, which I happen to have in my office, it's the whole back and forth about they want $1 billion in cash because now they'll lose their funds, their income from exports. The exports. Okay, well, we don't want to give you $1 billion in cash. What can you do instead? So eventually, it was supposed to be a non-monetary assistance package that was not fully defined before the Clinton administration was out of office. But it included all kinds of things like agricultural assistance. Actually, the Israelis came up with a proposal as well as that. So there was a lot of diplomacy around this. And, while we're in a different place now, it's very striking what a different place we are in as far as the advances in the program. And there's a table here that really lays it out. Table 3. So I think it was in the slides, but it is ongoing. Their improvements to the whole range of their missile programs is ongoing. So this leads us to this idea: is a testing moratorium enough? So as Josh said, this is the no-brainer option. The DC phrase is always the low-hanging fruit. So, but in this case, it might be what the North Koreans are comfortable offering. Clearly, they are doing it. So, and they've done it in the midst of other negotiations. The U.S. president has said very clearly that that is what he values most at the moment. So, as experts, how do you evaluate that? Is that enough? And how likely is the North Korean government going to accept a moratorium for a security calculation versus a negotiating strategy? Because now and in the past, the testing moratorium is very symbolic and it's used as a way to show that we are in talks, we are in diplomatic talks. So how should we change that dynamic so it's what you guys call sustainable? Now, if it's sustainable, what does that mean? If they can reassemble their testing facilities so quickly, does it mean that it needs to be linked to these other incentives? Does the UN Security Council have to be involved? I would say that this then leads quickly to the scope question. Is this our priority right now? Is this, as we've written about, through the true, you know, fault in their program would be lack of testing while they're doing all the R&D and development and deployment potential. So how important do we see this? And therefore, what are we willing to give for it to be sustained? And I am sort of purposely avoiding the whole topic of serialization and all of the steps that are well understood in our community for that to happen. Because this goes to the will, right? So when the country wants to denuclearize, the steps are clear and really quite obvious to anybody who's writing about nuclear weapons. On the missile side, there's similar dynamics, but what we have here is this question of willingness without a reciprocal action on the other side. So will the North Koreans want a reciprocity like we see? Obviously, the INF Treaty can be told much different, even though they're useful sort of monitoring models. But it was two countries doing the same thing for each other. So in this case, how does that affect the regional dynamics? First of all, if the South Koreans are going, if there's a North-South interplay on these limits, who is at the negotiating table? How are we talking through this with the South right now? With the cooperative threat reduction program, there are countries who are still dismantling their missile engines, even after all these years, and they're doing it, quite cooperatively, in Ukraine, but over this long, extended period of time. So how do we get at that problem? Say they're willing to disassemble these things. Do we want it to drive, how are we going to motivate a faster reward system for completing action? Of course, with the obvious technical caveats. Also, I wondered why you didn't put the export of missiles and technology right up the front as a priority. Because that seems to be something that some other models have posed, that will first of all show the North that is very important to the U.S. If it is, and also it's not something that it's not a change. We already want that. So we already have the full list of attempts to enforce interface and monitor. So, like with the JCPOA, there was an extensive protocol that outlined how to monitor the text. Something like that. Maybe that's another low non-proliferation while we're thinking about it. Oh yeah, okay, of course, the space launch issue. So the leap day deal just addressed the long-range missile test moratorium, and then was followed by a satellite launch that the U.S. and others interpreted as violating that moratorium, in accordance with the UN Security Council. So how do we talk about that upfront? I don't think we still have a clear idea whether the Obama administration talked that through with the North. We're waiting for the memoirs to come out on that one. But maybe I haven't read the right memoir yet. But that was a problem we anticipated at that time. So let's get ahead of some of that. Okay, so space launch, as you say in the paper, that would be something you wouldn't foresee North Korea as foregoing. That would continue to be a value for them. So how do you do that in such a way to not get over into this dual use benefit side? And then lastly, just back to the basic question of scope. I think it's really important to add that into the public debate from your perspective. the administration has said denuclearization includes removing or destroying all ICBMs. Okay, so that's on this end, and maybe we can find other quotes from administration officials that phrase it differently. But what are we really talking about? Because are you going to? Do we care about such? What is our priority? And I think this paper does do a good job of getting at that. But in your, that's critical. In your attempt to be very, precise and technical and offer different options for policymakers, of course, I want to know what you really think. And so I'm left hanging a bit at the end on the recommendation. So with that, I'll stop talking. Although there's so many different interesting verification issues that you get into when reading a paper like this about hiding facilities. What about the tunnels? North Korean specific deception measures are going to come up when Congress or anyone else is going to be asked to look closely at any deal that comes back. So I think that speaks in favor of high reliance on the NTN as a first step, and that was really interesting part.
Thanks. Well, thank you, Mary. So I think what we'll do is just kind of go down the panel here and responding to some of the initial comments and open it up to audience questions.
I'd like to focus on the question of why we didn't all proliferation. I think there are a couple of reasons. And as I've been in this business for a while, I've started to, I guess, sour a little bit on the village. There are things that an outside person never does, that are factors in it. Never going to see or understand. And before you can provide a very specific, detailed vision, I think you just have to help decision makers develop the vocabulary in the first place. That's one approach. Another approach is to say, here's my vision, and this is what I should look, and hope that people will rally. But I think that our approach, and maybe as a person sympathetic to this, is just to lay our cards out on the table and to get the policymakers to start thinking about the problem in the terms that we do. And they can come to their own conclusions about exactly which way to use these tools, if at all. I hope it is an opportune moment for that. Clearly the bloom is off the rose in this negotiating process between the Trump administration and the Clinton administration. But it's possible there will be a change of heart, a change of orientation, like what we saw under the Reagan administration, led to the INF Treaty. It's possible there will be a new administration. And it's possible that there would just be determination that we get whatever we can get. We take the low-hanging fruit and just defer the issue to the next one. So whatever your approach is, whether you are a Democratic campaign advisor or you're in the Trump administration, I'm hoping that there will be some. Another point, and this is kind of subtle, is the way we wrote it. And we didn't define this as U.S. negotiations. We just talked about who's negotiating partners. Well, I don't think it's realistic for the United States, not least of all because of our veto in the Security Council, which prevents substantial sanctions before Washington is ready for that. I do think maybe we have to think a little bit more broadly about who might be involved in these negotiations. So this is not just addressed to the White House, State Department. It is, I hope it will be really of interest to the Blue House, Beijing, Moscow. There are many stakeholders here. And, it could be that different stakeholders own different pieces of, like cooperative space launchers. That won't happen in the United States. That was anywhere, probably in Russia or Asia.
Well, I'd like to thanks for great questions. I'd like to sort of pick up a little bit on what Josh was saying in terms of how we kind of slice the analysis. And if you looked at it from a kind of U.S. point of view, which is the other thing in terms of security benefits, I mean, why is it, why is testing limits so important? I mean, the obvious thing is this reliability question with the ICBMs, because that affects your potential deterrent posture. If North Koreans cannot be confident of hitting the United States with ICBMs, that frees us from the dilemma of, will you trade Washington for Seoul or those kind of questions, or Tokyo, probably even more likely. So it gives us more freedom to maneuver. So that's why it's, that is clearly kind of the first thing from a U.S. policy point of view that you want in place, is to have that testing for use on ICBMs. In terms of the limits, I mean, I think the realistic limits are that probably the South Korean limits are kind of your starting point for what the North Koreans will accept. And that gives you that element of, fairness, or it's easier to argue, well, the South Koreans should be willing to take it too, rather than we're imposing a different standard on you than we are on other people. And the rest of you.
Just want to briefly touch back on the developments that happened with the Albright administration and the question of what do they want. So I guess it's when I first started this project with the team. Actually, I wasn't really as much familiar with North Korea as I would say like Middle East, for example. So I found it very ironic to reading about his offers from the Albright team and from Israel in the 90s, since it seemed to me very similar to what Trump was saying at the very beginning about developing North Korea and taking business in there. So I thought that was quite novel, but looking at it, it really wasn't at all. But with the breakdown of those negotiations, I think there is still a lot of room to explore possibilities for cooperation, especially on, I think, space launches and the ability of, or space programs in general, and turning any missile facilities or old ones, especially that are obsolete, into some profitable enterprises. But I do think it might be best to frame it mostly as a South Korean, North Korean progress at this point. I think it would make most sense, as Mal just said, that to go with limitations of the US and ROK missile guidelines seems the fairest, and it seems those two administrations are closer to be on the same page than North Korea is with the US so far. So maybe there is room to explore it over there.
If I can add a point to that, 800-kilometer limit in the US current instance in the US ROK missile guidelines. But it's two things of interest out of range from North Korea, at least from land. One is the entire nation of Tibet. Something to think about. Another is the Beijing. Also something to think about.
So, just kind of like playing off some personal notes and thoughts. looking at satellite imagery of what's happening on the ground in North Korea in relation to, or in regards to their ambition to continue operating in space. There is the new Pyongyang Satellite Control Center. There was construction activity that started sometime last year, and that activity continues to today. So there's a large warehouse, and there's likely going to be an auditorium for events or scientific activities. So if there's any indication that the North Koreans are still interested in operating in space, regardless of what we have now, it's that there's still work going on in areas related to them operating in that area. So that's one interesting indicator. And then in order to address the possibility of the North Koreans wanting to retain the ability to operate in space, you could do what the Iranians are doing, using older systems that aren't quite developed for use as an ICBM. Now that North Korea has two different types of ICBMs, they could initially still use it in the INF Treaty, which was the kind of boogeyman ICBM of years past, as something to kind of still maintain the ability to operate in space.
Open it up to folks in the audience. Questions? Mike?
Oh, great.